here with some reminders for managing strawberry arthropods. So I'm going to cover spider mites, strawberry rootworm, and sap beetle today. And one of the things I want to remind you about managing insect and mite pests of strawberries.
I just pushed the button on the keyboard.
Oh, I'm not sure if the clicker works, I'm sorry.
Okay, it doesn't work. That's good. I was going to try one more time just to see.
I'm not sure.
The pressure can be really variable, and we'll talk a little bit about spider mites. That's one of the ones that is particularly, it swings fast. So it's really important to monitor. I'll get to that. But also the economic impacts of these organisms can really vary depending on your market strategy and how you're producing the crop. So we don't have economic thresholds the way you might think of in some of these other types of crops where we know how much loss is going to happen and where it makes economic sense to manage the pest. It's really decide what is a level of concern, what is a level that your consumers are finding upsetting, and making decisions based on that. I also like to remind you that using IPM best practices of making sure you really identify the pest correctly and make sure that you have sufficient numbers of that pest to really warrant an action decision, and using preventative practices as much as possible really helps with making these decisions more successful. And then of course, there's various management strategies you can take. And I always like to remind people, check to see if it worked, keep some records. You will have a history of what's been happening in your fields and help you make better action and management decisions. For insects and mites, it's really important that you detect them early and identify them correctly. They can reproduce really quickly, and different products work better or worse for different insects. So it's really important. And then also there's typically more effective management options. Both the management options are more effective and there are more options if you have fewer pests at the moment. So the higher the population has built, the harder it is to manage them. So that maximizes your time for response if you are able to catch the issue early. So how do you catch the issue early? You have to be out there looking. So at least one dormant inspection I recommend. There are things that you can see when there's less leaves and less foliage, a little bit easier. And then also as regularly as possible from bud break through the fall. Weekly is ideal, especially for some of these pests like spider mites that I'll get into that just reproduce so fast. So they can go from very few to a lot fast. So I picked spider mites, strawberry rootworm, and sap beetles today. So we'll start with spider mites. Typically what you see first is the webbing and the stippling on the leaves. Oftentimes the leaves look like they're dusty because that webbing is picking up some of the dirt or sand. And then all of these little things here, those are actually the mites. But sometimes what you've found is the mite molts and what is left from the mites. By the time you found it, the mites have already died. So it's really important to look and see, are these things crawling, yes or no? Because they may already have boomed and busted. So in our area, they have a disease that sweeps through their population and they just all die off. So many of you have probably not dealt with this all the time. Tends to be more common in plasticulture, tends to be more common in the heat and the sand of the Eastern Shore than it does in matted row or in Central Maryland. But when we have periods of hot, dry weather, sometimes we get these. So at their extreme, you can also see stunted plants because they're feeding on the leaf tissue and sucking out the juices and making the plants weaker. So here's an example of some of the stunting that can happen. And so that reduces growth and yield when they're on the production there. And strawberries are especially vulnerable in the first 4 months after planting also. So this is a pest that you may want to manage more heavily when the plants are young. And as I mentioned, extended periods of hot, dry weather is usually where we really see these. And again, mites, like insects, their development is tied to the weather. They're cold-blooded, so the warmer it is, the faster they grow. So that's another reason why they really boom in the hot, dry weather. But they will also, if it's moist, they catch this pathogen. It's a fungus that just kills them right off. So I will reiterate, check for active infestations. They're very small, so you have to use a hand lens to really look at them. So these circular balls here, that's spider mite eggs. And then these are the spider mite different life stages. When they're nymphs, they have 6 legs, and when they're adults, they have 8 legs. As they're moving into overwintering, they tend to turn red. So they may be different colors. But these ones here are actually predatory mites that feed on the spider mites and feed on the spider mite eggs. So you may notice these in your field as well. And so and they tend to be on the underside of leaves. So you want to examine the underside of the leaves for about 50 plants and look for both the predatory mites and the spider mites. Because these are naturally occurring in our fields. And here's another species of them that's also red. The predatory mites, because they have to eat prey, they actually run really fast. So usually how I distinguish, is it a predator versus is it a plant pest? The plant pest, the plant doesn't run away. So they don't have to be very quick. But the predators have to chase something down. So they're quick, they'll be running. And one predatory mite to every 10 spider mites, the predatory mites will keep them suppressed. You won't have an economic problem. So, and I'll mention in a minute, you can buy these if you don't have them in your field, but when you're out there scouting, take a look and see what you have available. As I mentioned, in the first 4 months of the plant's life, they're a little more susceptible, so we tend to say about 5 mites per leaf is when you might want to be taking an action, versus later in the season, 20 mites per leaf, the plant will still be okay. Sometimes people use a different rule of thumb of about 25% of the leaves infested. If the population's quickly rising, that means you should do something about them. These are a pest where if the plant is already weakened or stressed, they do really well. They actually really are limited by protein, so that extra fertilizer and nitrogen makes them happy. So if you have over-fertilized, they're going to reproduce faster. And you want to avoid excess nitrogen. And having a vigorous plant, so having adequate chilling, the nurseries are going to sell you your plants already chilled, so this is not a problem in our area. But if you're trying to produce strawberries yourself and you are chilling them, adequate chilling, making sure that the plant's going to be really healthy will help you with spider mites. If you want to purchase predatory mites, you want to do it when you have about 5 pest mites per leaflet, or even earlier than that, so they have time to feed on them and catch up to the population before the pest mites get too numerous. And typically you want to release about 2 to 3 predators per plant if the pest mites are low. If you've let the population get a little high, you want to release 5 predators per plant when pest mites are high. How can you do that? You don't count them. You're not going to be out there with a paintbrush. No. So if you're interested in buying these, I would recommend talking to your supplier. They will tell you which species to get. Sometimes I often recommend a mix of species because there's species that are more generalist and species that are more specialist and that do better in different weathers. So having a mix sometimes kind of hedges your bet better. And they have ways to distribute them. So a lot of times in the greenhouse industry, they have basically it's kind of like if you were distributing seeds, but you're distributing mites and you just blow them out. And you can just walk and blow them out. People will drop them out of drones, but you don't sit there and put them in. You just calculate how many mites you're buying, and then it's almost like spraying. And so depending on which company you buy them from, they'll have their recommendations for how you spread them. Because it also depends. Like this one, you can see they're kind of on vermiculite, and so you just sprinkle the vermiculite and it has mites on it. So there's different ways that they distribute them. But yes, that's like the fluid ounces per acre. 5 mites per plant. So how many plants do you have out there? That's how many mites you need to buy.
Kelly, are people actually using that as a primary means of control or more of a, before it becomes an inferno, applying predatory mites to keep it from being inferno, rather than trying to treat an inferno with predatory mites?
So the beauty of predatory mites is that they will find the pest mites before you will, right? They're hungry, they're seeking. So a lot of people do use them as an insurance to keep the population low in the early part of the season, but you can release them like a pesticide and just release a lot of them and knock the population back. So a lot of times where people are doing this, both conventional and organic commercial production in California and Florida will release predatory mites for spider mites. And it is actually economic.
It is economically feasible.
It is, it's economically
Because
feasible.
at one time it wasn't.
No, there's enough people producing them
Yeah.
that is possible.
Okay.
I have heard some people, if possible, it's nicer to buy your biological control species from the East Coast so they don't have to travel in the mail. You want to make sure they're arriving alive. But yeah, they can be very effective and they can be economic. And actually, when I have spider mites on my houseplants, you can order these through Amazon. And it works great. Sprinkle them on your houseplants. It's a beautiful thing.
Preemptively, on strawberries, what would the timing be like? Like it bloom or something?
Well, it's going to be dependent on when you're starting to see mites. So if you're starting to see a little bit of mites, you would put them out. Around bloom is a good time because some of the species, so I think it's Gallindromus occidentalis, it actually will also feed on pollen, so it can kind of hold itself over on pollen while the spider mites are not there and kind of be there waiting. So that's why you want to talk to the supplier about which species you have and what makes them happy, because they vary in how happy they'll be in different situations. Yeah. Okay. For chemical control and biological control, you may want to just treat hotspot areas. Spider mites often end up making hotspots where they're doing really well and they're spreading from sort of an epicenter. And so you don't necessarily have the whole field infested at a time. And that's another thing with a biological control, then it's an easy spot to target when you're releasing. In terms of chemical controls, this was not always the case either. There are lots of effective miticides available. Spider mites are notorious for developing resistance. So you really want to rotate modes of action if you have a persistent problem. They're one of the pests that has developed resistance to the most numbers of products. And I put up here, there are more than this actually registered in strawberries. There's more active ingredients in groups. But these ones in group 20 are all ranked excellent and really highly recommended. So I tried to put some of these ones that we really think are excellent. Portal and Oberon, also excellent mite products. Savay and Zeal often are only ranked good, but I think the real problem is they're actually quite good. They're actually better than good, but they only target eggs and juveniles. So you need to make sure the eggs and juvenile stages are there if you're going to be using those products. And a lot of times, if you are having season-long problems with spider mites, which is not what's happening in our area, but is sometimes happening in Florida, these are good products to start with in your rotation in the early part of the season when they first start getting going. If you're an organic producer, your best bet is actually summer weight horticultural oils. So you want to make sure, again, that they're summer weight so that you're not getting phytotoxicity issues. And be careful if you've applied Captan or carbaryl or sulfur in the last couple of weeks, because that horticultural oil will cause a phytotoxicity issue when those products have been used. But that's your best bet for OMRI. And I will also put a plug, do not use insecticides. Sometimes people will say that they have some efficacy for mites. They make mites reproduce faster. You've irritated them just enough that they reproduce faster. So Brigade, Danitol, and Diazinon are bad choices for mites. Use a miticide. And again, check which stages of mite you have present if you're going to use some of these ones that target specific life stages like eggs and larvae. They're on the underside of the leaf. So you have to have thorough coverage and high pressure to get to the underside of the leaf. when you're spraying for mites. So now we'll talk about rootworm. Many people have told me they have this problem. Unfortunately, nobody works on it because it's not a common problem. So you will recognize that you have strawberry rootworm because you see numerous small holes on the leaves. That's usually your first sign. That's the adult feeding. It's like a shotgun feeding. The larvae feed on the roots, which is why they're called rootworms. And I was told at a previous meeting, sometimes that root feeding opens them up to some of the disease problems. But typically, the larval feeding on the roots is not enough to stunt a plant or cause issues in most cases.
We've had it. We've had the rootworm.
You've had the rootworm, but were the larvae causing stunting, or you had the adults causing holes in the leaves?
Bob Rouse identified as holes, shotgun holes in the leaves. He says, spray at night, one application, take care of it.
Yeah? Good. Excellent. I'm going to tell you the same thing. I love it. Beautiful. You can give this talk. No. They're nocturnal feeders. This is why you spray them at night, because they're active at night. And that's when you're targeting the larvae are in the roots, so you're not going to get them. You got to get the insect while they're up there on the plant in the foliage. So in the daytime, if you're looking for them, look at the base of the plant in the debris, because that's where they're going to be resting. But they're much harder to find in the daytime than they are at nighttime. Typically, again, management, you have to kill the adults, so you have to get to where the adults are. And it's thought, the rule of thumb is if you're seeing 10 to 20 beetles per square feet, which is actually quite a lot of beetles. So typically, again, this is not considered an economic problem. Strawberries can handle a little bit of holes in their leaves. The reason they build up periodically in our area is because they really like strawberries. And so if you don't rotate to other crops that are not strawberries, or your strawberry fields are close together, they're building up in the location. And one of the things that I didn't mention, this is one, because you're not, like rotation works, it's not that mobile. It's not moving that far. But having strawberry fields next to each other or using the same ground over and over for strawberries is how you're building up rootworm. And so it's important to spray at night when they're active. So it is worth looking for the beetles and making sure they're out and active before you're spraying. So that way you're definitely targeting and killing the adults. We recommend Brigade of pyrethroid insecticide for conventional operations for spraying for strawberry rootworm. It is not specifically listed on labels, so be careful depending on which state you are. Some states will let you apply as long as the site is on the label, and some the pest has to be on the label. And this is such an unusual pest, it's not on labels. And again, it hasn't been studied that much, but my best bet for what you would use if you're an organic producer is Entrust. Entrust tends to be our best organic beetle product, but no one has done efficacy trials on that. So sap beetles are another beetle that is more mobile, and it produces circular holes that are soft and sunken on the edges. So you can see here, this is sort of the edge of the hole. You can start to see it sort of shriveling. Same on the edge of this hole. That is in contrast to the cleaner edges that slugs make. So slugs, the flesh is still quite firm around the edge of the hole compared to that last one. Also, slug holes this is a nice circular slug, but they tend to be more irregular, and you can also see kind of the slime trail there. So that's one of the ways you can distinguish. And one of the reasons I bring this up is because it can be difficult to distinguish slugs and sap beetles, and they can happen together, or the slugs can get in there and make a hole, and then sap beetles follow them into the strawberry. So the sap beetles are not always the primary problem. The other thing about slugs is that they also will feed on leaves. So if you see these lacy patterns, slugs have a rasping mouth part. So they actually basically sandpaper away tissue. And so when they're doing that, they don't always do a clean job of it, and that's why you get this white where they partially got through the leaf. And so if you're seeing damage on underripe fruit, if you see some of this damage on the leaves as well, it's more likely to be caused by slugs than it is to be caused by sap beetles. They really like the smell of ripe and overripe fruit, and really overripe fruit. And in particular, they seem like they like the smell of anthracnose fruit rot. So they're attracted to fruit rot, and they will spread it also. So they get in and they're moving around, touching spores, and then moving between different fruits. So they can be an issue where they're together with fruit rots. We have multiple species of sap beetle, not even beyond this. But the strawberry sap beetle is the one that I really see in strawberries. You can see the dusky sap beetle in strawberries sometimes. This is the one that more often I will see in field and sweet corn. And this one, the four-spotted one, and there's another picnic beetle that looks very similar to this one. It's bigger. It is really, really attracted to overripe fruit. So you'll usually see it on one of these melting fruits. So it's usually not a primary pest. So the strawberry sap beetle is a bit smaller, and it has an X on its back. Right there. No, it's not that clear, unfortunately. But that's the one I almost always see in strawberries. So these two are the ones that are typically the problem. The reason I bring this up too is if you're looking at research out of Florida, they get more species that are similar to the dusky. So a lot of their efficacy trials are actually on dusky sap beetles, not on strawberry sap beetles. And then the larvae have these smoky gray spots behind their heads, and you can see that there's really a brown head and a little bit of a hook on the tail, and they have legs. So if the larva inside your fruit does not have legs, it is not a sap beetle. It's probably a Spotted-winged Drosophila or some other fly that doesn't have legs. Sap beetles overwinter in leaf litter and debris. They tend to overwinter in woods. They have a broad host range beyond strawberries. And so oftentimes what happens is as they're moving through crops over the season, some of the last crops they're in are raspberries and blackberries, or they've moved into fruits in the woods. And so they'll overwinter underneath leaf litter in the woods or below perennial crops. And then in the spring, they come into strawberries. So in 2021, we did some preliminary strawberry monitoring to try to see, because there were some questions about whether or not they could be overwintering within strawberry fields. And what we did is we tried to see when and where they came from. So we used these passive traps. So this is called a malaise trap. It's basically got a big piece of fabric that they crash into. And then this is intercepting them between the woods and the strawberry field. They crash into this piece of fabric, and they crawl up and into a collection device at the top there. So this thing is pretty big, about 6 feet maybe in length, to give it some space for them to crash into. And the only thing, it's just intercepting them between the woods and the strawberry field. This is called an emergence trap. We basically weighted down a tent over the strawberries, and then there's a collection at the top, because most insects will crawl up once they've fallen. So you get them to crawl up and then fall into a bottle. So that's how we sampled for them. And then I also looked at fruit to look for damage and look for insects. So what we found is in the first week after we installed these traps, around May 19th of 2021, there were not any sap beetles in any of the ways that we were sampling at either of the 2 sites that we checked in Central Maryland. In the last week of May, we started to see sap beetle adults in the fruit, but we weren't catching any in either of the traps. In the first week of June, we started to intercept them coming between the woods and the field, and we also were still seeing them in the fruit. And then in the second week of June, we saw them in all these traps. So what that tells us, and of course this is a preliminary study, is to me they probably are not coming out of the strawberries, because we didn't catch them in the traps until they were everywhere. And also you may see, basically I put sandbags to hold them down. It's possible they could get underneath there. So by the time we were fighting them inside the tents, they had probably been active for a while. This is only 6 feet, so it's possible it wasn't as sensitive as just looking at strawberries. But there definitely were some movement between the field, coming from the woods to the field. But the easiest way to find them was to just look for them. The other thing that we did while we were looking is we looked for what else was out there. So we found strawberry rootworm adults already by May 19th, and we also found slugs to be very active that year. We were starting to really see slug damage in that last week of May, as well as the adult sap beetles, as I mentioned. And in the first week of June, there were sap beetle larvae in these fruit, so they were being infested. And we had sap beetle larvae and adults. And that continued after the first week of June in that year. Another question, again, I always get is, will they feed on green fruit? And as I said, it's probably slugs if they're feeding on green fruit. But if you take them to your house and you put them in a Tupperware with a green fruit and give them nothing else to eat, they will eat green fruit. So it is technically possible for them to eat green fruit. You can also notice here, they like to be protected from predators. So they tend to feed underneath the calyx or where the fruit is touching the ground. They like to be protected. So this is one of the problems with trying to control them, is that they're on the underside of the fruit, hiding from insecticide, protected.
Did you video that?
Yeah.
Cool.
Now I know never to open a Tupperware container in your house.
I mean, there's a lot, yeah.
You never know, it
That's-
might pop out.
My family members have learned that lesson the hard way many times, actually.
I bet.
My husband's an entomologist too, so you really don't know what's in our house. There's nobody to stop us. So how do you determine whether or not they're active? One of the things that you can do is place a baited trap out and see if you're getting sap beetles. It's going to be more efficient than any of the traps that I was doing for this experiment. Experiments have shown when you try to bait them into something, you don't catch all of them. So it's better not to put it in your strawberries because the area around your trap is going to get infested. So put it by the woods. Put it away from the strawberries if you want to do this to avoid that spillover. And then what you want to do is put about 8 ounces of overripe or rotten fruit. And then I would put a mesh over it. I like paint strainer bags that you can buy at Home Depot, and then a rubber band. So that way you're not letting them get in and reproduce in your overripe fruit that you're using to attract them. And then you float that in a bucket of soapy water. So they're supposed to fall in the soapy water and drown, and then you can check it. If any of you have tried putting soapy water out for bugs in the middle of the summer, they start to rot really fast. So I would check it regularly, or it will get quite exciting. My students have learned as well. I do so many nice things to people. So the other thing that you can do to help manage your sap beetles is to do good fruit rot management. As I mentioned, they're attracted to overripe and rotten fruit. Cassandra Sweat, who was formerly at the University of Maryland, did a research project with anthracnose fruit rot, and she found that good anthracnose fruit rot management, using resistant cultivars and using fungicides and managing that well, reduced the sap beetle incidence in the field. So again, not attracting them in, trying to keep those smells that bring them in away helps. So this also means harvesting frequently, not leaving overripe fruit. I know in pick your own operations, it's really hard to keep the fields clean. People bite a strawberry and then throw it on the ground. But as much as possible, the more that you can clean up and those coals, you'll keep from attracting them in. And it's renovating your fields timely, managing coals as best you can. It's not only strawberries, because as I mentioned, they're in basically every fruit. They like overripe fruit. So this was a bunch of cantaloupe peels. It was swarming with sap beetles. So you have to manage all of the fruit that you have on your farm. As much as possible, reducing the favorability of the habitat. As I mentioned, they like to feed on the fruit where it touches the ground. So Galen Dively found in the past, and apparently is currently working on the paper, that matted row tends to have more sap beetles than plasticulture. And his thought on that is that because the fruit is touching the plastic and getting hot, it's less attractive to the sap beetles. In other areas people have looked at, especially, so sap beetle has been a problem in Europe, using nematodes to control them. And it seems like it might work. We haven't used it in our area. Nematodes are commercially available, and another product, make sure they're alive when you get it. There is a parasitic wasp that attacks the larvae that may be out there helping, but we haven't found it in our area or looked for it. Chemical management doesn't work that well for sap beetle because they're hiding underneath those fruit. The larvae and the beetles are inside the fruit. So where you do need to use chemical controls, you may need to spray every 7 days to get control. And typically we recommend Danitol. It's one of the best products for controlling them. And it's the one where if you want to do right before your first harvest, it's a good one to start with. Ryman is also an excellent product. It works on the larvae though. So you need to make sure that they're actively reproducing. So you notice I saw the adults first and then the adults and larvae. That's why Ryman is the second product that you want to come in with in your rotation. So wait till you have adults before you spray Ryman. In Florida spray programs, they found that programs that have both Danitol and Ryman work better than ones that use just Danitol. So that's our kind of best recommendation. It's thought that a sale might also have some efficacy, but there's not been as much work on that. And then again, if you're an organic producer, there's no efficacy data, but my suspicion is that Entrust is your best product. You might try Nemix or Moltex, which may provide some control, but because it's disrupting their molting, it's really going to work on the larvae. So like Ryman, it needs to be done once you have larvae. So one last plug for using IPM best practices. I like to leave a lot of time so that you can ask me questions about whatever you want. My lab did produce a sap beetle fact sheet, and I believe this QR code is in your packet if you want to find the fact sheet. It's available online, and you can also download it as a PDF. And I'm happy to take questions if you have questions, or if you want resources. My lab website and email are there. I'd like to thank everybody who funded me and who helps me with all this work. And I'll take any questions. Guy.
Excellent talk. Can I have permission to ask you a question? It has nothing to do with what you just talked about.
Yeah. Let's go rogue.
I had a horrendous problem with thrips on tomatoes.
Thrips on tomatoes.
Last season, wipe me out.
Uh-huh.
Wipe me out.
Fascinating. Wow.
So, and I talked to Jerry once, and he's like, yeah, you got a problem. I'm like, and that was the problem, yeah, you got a problem.
Yeah, you've got a problem. Okay. Well,
So
it's been confirmed by the expert that you have a problem.
what are your thoughts?
Flowers or foliage or both?
It's going to be on the fruit.
They just burn my hands off. I would like blowtorch feel.
So you were they were attacking the foliage. Interesting.
Yeah, total collapse. And the plantings are right next to each other, so they jump from the first planting to the second, to the third, to the fourth. Just as they ripened, they just went right along and wiped them out.
All over my tomatoes, all over my dahlias, thrips were horrible last year.
Yeah. The
They
drought.
just seem to kind of laugh at insecticide.
Well, they're like spider mites. They like to be on the underside of the leaves. They especially actually like to hang out along the leaf vein. So they're a little bit sheltered. And that's what I was going to say. I can't think of, it's been a long time, since I've seen efficacy data on thrips. So I'm not gonna give you an insecticide recommendation off the top of my head, because they are something that gets resistant like spider mites. So it could be that there's a resistance issue. It's possible. I do think, like was mentioned, that it was a bad year last year because of the drought. None of the plants out in the environment had water. So it just concentrated all kinds of weird things in fields because that was the only thing that was irrigated and green. So it is very unusual to see thrips at that level. So hopefully it won't happen again. But I can get back to you about an insecticide recommendation if it does happen again. They are another thing that in greenhouse systems you can release predators for. But at the field scale for thrips, it's funny you bring this up because when I was doing my Ph.D. actually there was a visiting scientist from China in the lab and I was supposed to be helping him. And so I was sucking thrips out of flowers all over campus and nobody ever stopped me and asked me what I was doing so that he could do insecticide bioassays on them and see if they were resistant. But let me look up what's currently working.
Thank you.
They can be a heck of a problem with daylilies. And I think the daylily people pull out some kind of organophosphate to begin with, which is like so far from my view. But I'm trying to think of parallel crops where thrips are an issue. And the only one I can think is daylilies and they use nasty.
We use Lanate,
Yeah.
and, regular Lanate combined with something else. It probably helped somewhat, but we took it on the nose.
I don't know.
Greenhouses use, I had better luck with greenhouse control on greenhouse crops.
They have everything in the same place. And you can also put up
And
thrips netting
I can
and,
do it from a couple of different angles.
yeah.
Uh,
But no, they're notorious for developing resistance to lots of things. So I'm not surprised they laughed at your insecticides.
Well, thank you.
I got another question. For years, we've put on Zeal, first week in November, just, for mice overwintering. When we were overwintering by adding straw over the plants, and then again, when we were using grow covers over strawberry plants. But a couple years ago, I said, well, die if there would be. And so now I'm wondering, do I still need to apply Zeal if there's no protection? What do you think?
So spider mites will overwinter. That's why I was mentioning, they turn color when they're starting to overwinter. So they change their physiology to be more resistant. They also go down into the foliage. So usually the winter doesn't kill them.
So I still need to apply Zeal?
It's possible.
Okay.
I mean, did you see active mite problems?
I just spray, because, I don't put any fungicides on, so give me a break. So, no, I mean,
We gotta control something here.
yeah, right. So, I guess I just do it because, my support scientist for years did an excellent job producing great fields.
Mhm.
And I made him write down all the directions, what to do when, and I just do it, but it's automatic, and that's why I'm asking you now. I'm not gonna change something that's worked forever and ever without getting input from an expert.
Well, the other thing I was gonna say is, do you have issues over with cyclamen mites?
Only when we get plants from
Right.
somewhere else,
Right.
and usually we only have our own plants.
Because it is unusual in our area to have spider mite issues, especially in the fall. Usually it's humid enough that they're not that happy.
Okay.
I think of it as a midsummer issue.
Mhm.
So I think you probably don't need the fall application, and the spring one might not be a bad idea.
Well, I haven't done it in the spring.
You haven't done it in the
I
spring.
haven't, no, I only did it in the fall.
Okay.
Whether it made sense or not, I just did what I was told. I'm just trying to get by. with insects. So nice.
I would be surprised if you needed medicine foam.
Okay, well, that's good news. That'll make our spray guy happy. He can wash out his sprayer sooner.
And also, are you looking at, like, do you grow plugs in the greenhouse first without the plants?
Yes.